When a VFX element is added to the footage, it needs to be placed at the proper distance from the lens. This means that the element most likely needs to be inserted behind some parts of the footage, unless the element is in front of everything else. For example, adding a sign to a storefront at the opposite side of a busy street means that all the people and cars that pass in front of the sign need to be separated and then put back on top of the newly added sign. This is a constant challenge, because, as discussed in the previous chapter, the footage itself is two-dimensional and there is no way to separate objects within it based on their distance from the camera. 3D camera tracking can solve the relative position of objects, but cannot accurately trace their outline. Separation is not just required for depth sorting. In many instances, a specific area in the footage needs to be treated or modified. This area needs to be isolated, and any parts in the footage that stand or cross in front of it need to be separated too, otherwise they will become affected by the treatment. For instance, if you want to change the color of a car that passes behind some trees, you need to isolate the simple cleanup of a sign on the bus requires separating the elements that are in front of the bus, the kid, the woman, and the tree. Extremely loud and incredibly close. Copyright Warner Brothers, Scott Rudin Productions, Paramount Pictures. Visual effects by Brainstorm Digital. Separation 49 car in order to change its color without affecting the background, but at the same time you also need to isolate the trees in front of it, otherwise the color change on the car will affect them too. As you can tell, the task of separation is an essential and fundamental process in VFX. It may therefore come as a surprise that there really are only two methods of doing it: rotoscoping, roto, and green screen. Both methods, to be perfectly honest, are not quite high-tech elegance, and both require a considerable amount of work on the part of the VFX team, and in the case of green screens, also on the part of the film crew. Rotoscoping existed long before computers. In the 1959 Disney animation film Sleeping Beauty, for example, real actors were filmed first, then the animators traced their contour and applied these resulting moving shapes to the animated characters as a sort of pre-digital motion capture technique. See Chapter 5. Technically speaking, modern rotoscoping, roto, is very similar. The artist articulates the contours of the subject with a line, rotospline, that is defined by numerous dots, roto points. It is essentially the same as drawing a line around the subject with a pencil, but the difference is that the dots can be animated over time, and thus the roto shape can accurately follow the movements and deformations of the subject. Partial roto for the kid. Notice that a separate roto shape is used for the head and the upper torso. Roto for complex subjects like people is usually broken down into many pieces, which helps the process of animating the roto and makes it more efficient. VFX fundamentals 50 in most cases, and especially when rotoing people, animals, and other organic forms, the complex movement and ever-changing silhouette means that the roto points need to be animated frame by frame, and the more complex the shape is, the more points will be needed to precisely articulate it. Evidently, roto is a laborious and time-consuming process. Long shots that require lots of roto can take days or weeks to finish, even with several roto artists working in tandem. But in the absence of a green screen, or when a green screen is not practically possible, roto is the only option for separating a subject from the background. In small amounts, roto is an indispensable part of the basic compositing workflow. But shots that require massive amounts of roto can become expensive and time-consuming, and should be avoided unless a green screen option is absolutely not feasible. Roto works well for subjects with hard, well-defined edges, but is not as successful for thin wispy parts like hair and fur, or when edges are very fuzzy, for example, when the subject is out of focus or when it has motion blur. At the very beginning of The Wolf of Wall Street there's an 80s-style TV commercial with several shots of a lion calmly walking through a busy office. The lion was real, held on a leash by a trainer, and so were the office workers. For obvious reasons, they were shot separately, the lion in the empty office and then the same office full of people, but without the lion. A green screen was not practical in this setting, so we had to roto out the lion in order to put the office workers behind it and remove the trainer and the leash. The body of the lion could be easily roto-ed. But the lion's mane was a totally different story. It is quite impossible to roto out thin, semi-transparent strands of hair. There's simply no way of separating such fine detail from the background using roto. Teehee lion from The Wolf of Wall Street had to be cut out so that the office workers could be inserted behind it. The outer parts of the mane were recreated, because this type of detail is too thin and wispy to be extracted with roto. Separation 51. What we did instead was to roto the mane closer to the roots, where it's solid enough, and leave out the wispy parts. We then recreated those wispy parts as static single-frame elements, and tracked them to the lion's movement. Basically, we created an artificial mane that looked close enough to the original one, but did not require a frame-by-frame roto. A green screen, see later, enables a much better separation of fine, semi-transparent detail, and provides a consistent, rather than busy, background. It is therefore important to consider the type of subject before deciding on whether to place a green screen or resort to roto. A head covered with a hat will be much easier to roto out than one with long frizzy hair. At this point you might wonder why, with all that cutting-edge technology invested in visual effects, people are still painstakingly moving points frame by frame to trace the shape of an actor. Couldn't there be some smart algorithm that enables the computer to distinguish between an actor and the background? The answer is no, at least, not yet. While any toddler can easily tell where a person's head ends and the background starts, the level of artificial intelligence that a computer needs to figure this out is still well out of reach. Unlike those clunky face recognition algorithms found in many consumer cameras, VFX separation requires extremely accurate tracing of the outline of the subject. We distinguish between objects by recognition and association. The computer can only make a distinction based on numerical values. Color, for example, is something that the computer can evaluate much more accurately than humans. But in any regular setting, the actors and the background behind them have too many similar colors to allow a computer-assisted, color-based separation, unless, of course, the background is made of one consistent color that does not appear in the foreground. And this, in fact, leads us to the second separation method. Green screen. Arguably no other subject in visual effects is discussed ad nauseum like green screens. Sometimes it seems as if green screens are the symbol, the essence, and the raison d'etre of visual effects rather than a mere tool for separation. We talk about green screen movies and green screen actors. But green screens are not a fashion, nor a style, they are simply a means to allow cleaner and faster separation of subjects. That said, they are indeed a vital tool that merits detailed discussion because it is one of those areas in VFX that relies equally on the successful performance of the film crew and the VFX team. It is also an area where it's crucial for the filmmaker to understand the techniques and challenges of green screen extraction and compositing. Many of those problems can be minimized, or avoided altogether, by properly setting up and lighting the screen and the subject on set. The practical issues of physically setting up the green screen, color consistency, coverage, shadows, spill, tracking markers, lighting, etc., will be discussed in Chapter 8. Here, I would like to offer some insight into common issues of green screen extraction, problems that seem to prevail in post even when the screen was perfectly placed and lit on set. These problems may affect the final look of the shot, potentially causing it to feel comped and unnatural, though it's often hard for the filmmaker to pinpoint the exact cause. VFX Fundamentals 52. First, if you were wondering, let me explain why I haven't mentioned blue screens so far. The use of blue screens has declined in recent years. There are several reasons for this, these being the main ones. Digital camera sensors are inherently more sensitive to green than blue. The blue channel is much grainier than the green channel. Under similar lighting conditions, green comes off brighter than blue, making it easier to light a green screen. A blue screen is obviously still needed when green color is present in the scene, vegetation, for example, and is still sometimes preferable to green in low-light scenarios because it bounces less light back. Generally, though, green screens work better as they are easier to light and easier to extract. Still, the discussion of green screens in this chapter and in Chapter 8 applies equally to blue screens, the principles are the same. The challenges of extraction. The idea of a green screen is simple, since the computer can analyze color with great precision, placing a background of a consistent color, assuming that color does not appear anywhere on the subject, makes it easy for the computer to distinguish between the subject and the background, and provides a fast way to separate the subject without rotoscoping. Highly saturated green is far removed from human skin tones and does not frequently appear on clothes and most objects, so it is a good choice as a background color. It all sounds straightforward enough, but unfortunately it rarely works as smoothly as you'd expect, for a number of reasons which I will detail. The green screen extraction process, as it's usually called, some still like to refer to it as pulling a key or keying, is therefore far from being a push-button affair, and requires considerable work and a fair amount of expertise from the compositor. A perfectly uniform and well-lit green screen is obviously important for achieving a clean extraction, but is not a guarantee for a successful shot. Let's look at some of the challenges and issues that affect green screen extractions. Background matching. The number one reason for unsuccessful green screen compositing is not the quality of the green screen, the difficulties of extraction, or the skills of the compositor, it is the choice of background that replaces the green screen. Many filmmakers assume that a green screen gives them the freedom to place any kind of background behind their subject, but this assumption is wrong. It is very difficult to marry successfully a background and a foreground that are very different in terms of lighting, perspective, luminance values, or hues. Its separation 53 does not matter how clean and well lit the green screen is, or how skilled the compositor is at extracting fine detail, there is nothing that contributes more to that infamous green screen comp look than a total mismatch between foreground and background. It is therefore necessary to think in advance about the background and the environment that the subject will eventually be in, and light both the subject and green screen with that environment in mind. For example, if you plan to put a dark and ominous sky behind the subject, don't shoot the subject in bright outdoor light. Shoot indoors instead, or use black overhead screens to reduce the intensity of the natural sky light. Likewise, if you plan to place the subject in a bright, sunny environment and you must shoot on a stage or under a cloudy sky, light the subject with a strong warm key and bluish fill. Once the shot has been captured, it is equally imperative not to try to force a mismatched background behind the subject, because it is very hard, often impossible, to change the lighting on 2D footage. A green screen shot from a short movie that I used for my compositing course at FX PhD. Courtesy of FX PhD/Eduardo Abin. VFX Fundamentals 54 Teehee green screen is replaced by the background, but the shot is still not working. There is too much of a difference in contrast, brightness, and hue between the bright, hazy, and warm foreground and the rather dark and cool background. Notice also how the background feels too sharp and in focus compared to the foreground. Courtesy of FX PhD/Eduardo Abin. Some color and focus adjustments improve the shot quite a bit, making everything feel more integrated and natural. Courtesy of FX PhD/Eduardo Abin. Separation 55. In Chapter 8 I will describe the on-set process of shooting a complex sequence of a nighttime crane dare over NYC for the movie Nerve. In post, we had to deal with shots captured by two different cameras. One was a GoPro-style action cam attached to the head of the stunt as he precariously walked on the crane, the other was an Alexa on a techno crane that showed actor Dave Franco from the POV of a drone camera. Both types of shots were done in a fairly bright, consistent ambient lighting environment because of the extensive use of green screens, in essence a day-for-night scenario. When we composited the shots, we darkened and graded the foreground footage. This worked very well with the GoPro first-person POV footage, because we could really take down the brightness and saturation of the crane to match it to the NYC nighttime background. But it was much harder to make it work with the drone POV shots. Here the reduced brightness caused the actor's face to go too dark. Brightening the actor would make him feel detached from the environment, brightening just his face would make him look weird, and brightening the environment instead would create a mismatch with the first-person POV shots in the sequence. We ended up doing a bit of everything to make the foreground and background work together, but it was certainly a difficult balancing act, not unlike walking on a crane at night. Hanging from a crane over a New York City street. Nerve. Copyright Lionsgate, Allison Schirmer Productions, Keep Your Head, Supermarch. Visual effects by Brainstorm Digital. Spill. Green spill, or blue, in case of a blue screen, is an unavoidable side effect, although it can certainly be minimized on set by following a few simple rules, see Chapter 8. Compositors have some excellent spill suppression tools at their disposal, and these are used to kill areas of unwanted green hue on the subject without changing the overall color balance. But if you are reviewing a VFX shot and the subject still feels a bit odd and unnatural, it might be that spill is still present. Look especially around shiny skin areas like the forehead, bright clothing, and wispy hair and fur. Conversely, sometimes a heavy-handed spill suppression affects too much of the original color. Overly red or magenta skin tones are usually a sign of excessive spill suppression. VFX Fundamentals 56 Teehee actress in front of the green screen before extraction. Courtesy of FX PhD/Eduardo Abin. After extraction and with background added. Notice the green spill around the wispy edges of her hair, as well as on her white shirt. Courtesy of FX PhD/Eduardo Aben. Separation 57T green spill is suppressed. Courtesy of FX PhD/Eduardo Aben. Sometimes, spill occurs even where the green screen is not visible. In this frame, the camera is looking at the opposite direction of the green screen, but the green is still reflected in the glass panels. Spill suppression helps bring the color back to a neutral place. Courtesy of FX PhD/Eduardo Aben. Non-solid edges. If the green screen is clean, consistent, and well lit, one can assume that the computer can accurately extract the subject. This assumption is right as long as the edges of the subject are sharp and solid. But this is hardly ever the case, as edges are often soft and semi-transparent. This can happen with hair and VFX fundamentals 58 fur, as in the lion example earlier, thin wires, garments, smoke, and steam, or simply because an otherwise solid subject like a person is out of focus or motion blurred, or both. In all these cases, the soft, semi-transparent edges are harder to extract, because they partially contain the green screen. This often results in dark or bright edges, or areas that seem unnaturally sharp and cut out. Since these issues are often very subtle and hard to spot, the best way to detect them is to compare the VFX version with the original green screen footage, an easy thing to do on the Avid or any other editing tool. Experienced compositors have a whole arsenal of methods and tricks to extract tough areas like hair, bring back soft motion blurred edges that get cut off in the extraction process, or even extract wispy smoke or fog. That said, sometimes extractions are overly processed in an attempt to fix bad edges. A good example is light wrap. In real-life photography, very bright areas in the background tend to subtly spill over the edge of the foreground subject, a familiar occurrence when shooting against the sun or when there's a light source right behind the subject. Some compositors tend to overuse light wrap in order to cover or hide bad edges. Light wrap is a great way of tying the foreground to the background and improving integration, but only when it's used judiciously. Green screen shots can and should look natural and convincing. But if a shot feels a little off, look first at the relationship between the subject and the background. Is the lighting similar? Are the colors and luminosity matching? Does the focus make sense? If all this feels good, look at the edges, and compare T. His is a tricky extraction, because one actress is fully in focus while the other is completely out of focus. Courtesy of FX PhD/Eduardo Aben. Separation 59. When the subjects are extracted and comped over the background, two problems surface. First, the soft defocused edges of the distant actors carry too much of the original green screen in them. Second, there are areas in the background that are much darker than the original green screen, which causes edges to pop out unnaturally. This is especially apparent on the screen left shoulder of the distant actress, as well as all around the hair of the closer one. Courtesy of FX PhD/Eduardo Aben. Additional compositing work was done to alleviate the issues of soft edges and mismatched luminosity, and the integration between foreground and background now feels less disjointed. Courtesy of FX PhD/Eduardo Aben. VFX Fundamentals 60 to the original footage. Is an out-of-focus object too sharp at the edges? Does a fast-moving arm lack the motion blur trail? Are there any unnaturally dark or bright edges along the subject? Both green screen and roto are essential for separation but are far from ideal solutions. Eventually they will be replaced by better, more efficient technologies, see Chapter 10, The Future, but until then, roto and green screen remain a fundamental aspect of visual effects and require attention and diligence when planning the shots, on set and during post.